Something that Benjamin Franklin liked to do at dinner parties was he would ask his host for a Bible, and then he would open the Bible. But instead of reading what was printed on the page, he would instead recite a story of his own creation, just to see if anyone would notice. One of those stories that he frequently told became known as the parable against persecution. Once upon a time, Franklin said, Abraham, the great hero of the Old Testament, was visited by a man who was 198 years old. But as evening approached, Abraham discovered that that man had no place to spend the night. So Abraham invited him to stay with him in his home. But about midnight, God came to Abraham and asked, Abraham, where is that stranger who came to you? Abraham replied, well, God, as he and I were talking here tonight, I discovered that he is different from me. He does not believe in you, O God. He does not worship you. He does not pray to you. So I cast him out of my home and drove him out into the desert. Why did you do that? God asked. If I have put up with that man for 198 years, nourishing him and feeding him, even though the way he is, could you not have put up with him and got along with him for just one night? Do you get the point of Benjamin Franklin's story? His comment, of course, is about the way that we so often assume that in order to show God how true and faithful we are, that we feel the need to go out and hate and oppose anyone whose understanding of God is different from ours. That's what the Nazis in Germany did. Hitler got people to rally around him in part because he said to the Christians in Germany, there are Jews in our midst who do not worship God the way that we do. They do not believe the same things about God that we do. And so if we are to be true and faithful to God, we have an obligation to hate and eliminate the Jews. Or back in the Middle Ages, Christian religious leaders rallied the people by saying, the Muslims who live in Jerusalem and in the Holy Land worship differently than we do. They believe different things about God than we do. So if we want to be true and faithful to God, we have an obligation to hate and eliminate those Muslims. So, for example, at the Council of Narbonne in 1054, church leaders met together and declared, no Christian should kill another Christian, for whoever kills a Christian undoubtedly sheds the blood of Christ. That doesn't sound so bad. But what's important to notice is that the previous law had stated, no Christian should kill another human being. So the church was changing the law to say that as long as you didn't kill Christians, it really didn't matter who you killed. A few years ago, the noted atheist Richard Dawkins produced a documentary for British television called Source of All Evil. The basic point of the show was to say how, in the opinion of that atheist, religion and belief in God in general was the source of most of the evil in the world. For the commercial advertising that show, the words, imagine world without religion appeared on the screen. As the camera zoomed in on downtown Manhattan, where conspicuously displayed were the twin towers of the World Trade Center buildings. The point, obviously, was to say that if we did live in a world where there wasn't religion, the kind of violence that resulted in the destruction of the World Trade Center buildings would never take place. Prince Hamlet in Shakespeare's play wonders aloud, to be or not to be, that is the question. But more recently, it seems that the issue on the minds of many Christians is to burn or not to burn. That is the question. To burn or not to burn the Quran. In the view of some Christians, in order to prove and demonstrate their faith and loyalty to God, they believe that God wants them to burn the Muslim scriptures. Is that what God wants us to be doing? Today's reading from 1 Timothy begins with these words. First of all, then, I urge that supplications, prayers, intercessions, and thanksgivings be made for everyone, for kings and all who are in high positions. I think, though, that the problem is that we often miss what those words are really saying. We hear the passage say, pray for kings and for those in high positions. And we think to ourselves, okay, God wants us to pray for the Queen of England. She's a nice enough lady. Yes, we should pray for the Queen of England, but that's not what this part of the Bible is really getting at. And it's not just saying that we should pray for our own government leaders, even if we might disagree with them on taxes or healthcare reform or welfare reform. No, back in the first century, when this passage was written, being told to pray for kings and for those in high positions meant being told to pray for people who hated you, to pray for people who opposed you, to pray for people who at times would jail you or maybe even kill you because of your faith. Back in the first century, when this passage was written, there were no Christian kings. There were no Christian rulers. No kings and rulers were people like Pontius Pilate and King Herod, who conspired to have Jesus crucified. Kings and rulers were the kinds of people who saw to it that 10 of the original 12 apostles were put to death because of their faith. And so here, when we are told to pray for kings and for those in high positions, we are being instructed to pray for our enemies. But isn't that basically what Jesus taught us all along? After all, in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus said, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. And here in this passage in 1 Timothy, we're simply